Well, if there is a creator, I am so glad that she created Eliot Coleman. Eliot has practiced organic gardening for over 40 years. He has led study tours of organic farms, market gardens, orchards, and vineyards in Europe, and has written extensively on the subject, including 2 landmark books, The New Organic Grower and The 4-Season Harvest. Eliot divides organic farmers into 2 classes: shallow organic, those who mimic the practices of chemical agriculture to treat the symptoms of an infertile soil, albeit using organic fertilizers and pesticides, and deep organic farmers, those who try to replicate the soil-plant relationships found in the natural world. Eliot says the term organic as it's used today no longer has any connection with the highest quality foods. Rather, it has been subverted by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which has tailored the definition of organic to meet the marketing needs of the food giants who are trying to capitalize on the public's preference for wholesome food. Eliot prefers the term authentic food to describe locally grown and unprocessed food of exceptional quality. With his wife, Barbara, Eliot operates 4 Seasons Farm in Harborside, Maine, where throughout the year they supply their local community with fresh, delicious, and authentic food. Please welcome Eliot Coleman.
Well, no speaker could ever have had a better introductory act than I just had. That's wonderful. I'm a farmer, and there are not many of us left, so it's sort of nice when you get a chance to see one occasionally. I think we're down to about 1.5% of the population. But there's things you learn as a farmer that other people aren't aware of, and I thought that's what I might talk about today. The title, The Farm That Won't Wear Out, I actually stole from the title of a little book that came out 100 years ago. So I'm not telling you anything that people haven't known for a long time. I first ought to tell you what got me into agriculture. I used to be an adventurer. I think I spent far more time climbing mountains and running rivers in kayaks than I did on the usual productive work one is supposed to do. But one day I did read a book about small farming, and there was a line in there that impressed me more than anything I had ever read. And it said that in a teaspoonful of fertile soil, there are over 1 million live organisms. And as an adventurer, you usually try and explore places where no one has gone before. And I thought, my gosh, of all the exciting places to explore, think of that. There are 1 million live organisms in each teaspoon of fertile soil. This could get interesting. There is, obviously, as you all know, another approach to agriculture than the one I've been taking for 40 years. And I occasionally run into representatives of that other system. In fact, there is a very nice gentleman who retired recently from Monsanto, who lives in a town next door to where I live in Maine. And I would occasionally run into him in the local pub. And I remember the first time we were just sitting there chatting, and he mentioned that he had retired from Monsanto, and he said, and what do you do, Eliot? And I said, well, I'm an organic farmer. And there were a few other people there who thought immediately we should come to blows, but that never solves any problems. In fact, we have had some wonderful discussions. And in the course of them, he became aware of the fact that maybe, even though I was farming in a different way than he had been trying to sell all his life, that I wasn't all that stupid, and there were some pretty interesting things going on that I spoke about. And he said to me once, he said, okay, here's an interesting thing. I think you know something. why don't you try and start a business to get people to farm organically and sort of become the Monsanto of organic farming? And I said, well, that's a wonderful statement, a wonderful challenge, but I'll tell you, this is what the problem would be for that. Everything that I do, which is working with the free inputs of the natural world, are management inputs, not product inputs. So were I to try and start that business, I wouldn't last long, because the very first thing I would say to all my potential customers is, great news, folks, you don't have to buy anything. And there wouldn't be a business there. And he said, what do you mean by that? They don't have to buy anything? And I said, no. Let's think of all the management operations that could be part of this. For example, I use crop rotation. Now, crop rotation just means not growing the same crop year after year in the same place. The idea has been known probably for 4,000 years and practiced that long. And it is incredibly effective, especially where ecologists have done some interesting studies on the fact that certain crops actually prepare the soil more ideally for a crop following them than for another crop. And so if you pay attention to those, again, free natural inputs, you can run an exciting crop rotation that is unbelievably productive. And I said I also use green manures. Now, green manures are where I plant seeds of crops, the growth processes of which will either put lots of root mass into the soil, which is beneficial for organic matter, or are able to collect other nutrients like nitrogen from the air, which legumes can do. I said, again, I may have to buy seeds, but this is a management technique. A lot of these crops I'm growing, especially the legumes, have very deep roots. So I almost don't need any mechanical deep tillage, because if I grow these plants, they will send their roots down as they have been doing for hundreds of thousands or millions of years. And not only does that loosen up the soil and make it more amenable to the crops I want to grow, but those roots go way, way deep down and bring up new minerals, trace elements that are going to benefit the other crops I'm growing. And then I spoke to him about rotational grazing, where in the old days you would see farmers turn their livestock out into a big pasture and the cattle would eat the grass. The problem with that was that there were parts of the pasture that were possibly slightly tastier than others, and the cattle would eat those first, and then they would come back to them quickly the minute there was any regrowth, and pretty soon there wasn't much left. In rotational grazing, a very intelligent Frenchman studied what was going on out in the world of grasses and realized that the trick was to pay attention to the needs of the grass as much as the needs of the livestock. And he found out if after the cattle had had a day or two or three to eat the grass down, you moved them to a pasture next door that was ready, by the time, I would say about 45 days, when they came back to the first pasture, it had grown back up to the ideal height and nutrition, and you would go through this again. In other words, by paying attention, again, to the free inputs of the natural world, you had far better feed for your livestock than anything you could purchase. And then there are cover crops. Cover crops are a little bit like green manures, but you're planting them to protect the soil if it is not in use over winter, when it might be subject to erosion or other problems. And then, probably should have mentioned this first, but it's here on the list, compost. Now, compost is the world's best fertilizer. And you think, oh my gosh, that must be expensive. Well, actually, as I explained to this gentleman, compost is made for free in your backyard from waste products. And if it is the world's most marvelous fertilizer, isn't this a nice gift from the natural world for the farm that won't wear out? That any waste vegetable matter you have, you just throw it in a pile, and after a year or two, depending on whether you encourage it or not, it has broken down into if there are any magical products in agriculture, the magical product. And then I talked to him about mixed farming, which has always been the basis of long-term success for the old-time farmers, where instead of growing just vegetables or just grains or just livestock, the old-time farms had a mixture of all of them. And all these pieces fit together, and there were properties of one that benefited the next, and you went on through a little cycle until you came back. Again, all of this was stuff that you don't have to sell. These are management systems. There is a symbiosis going here, a partnership between all of these products. And this is what this little book, The Farm That Won't Wear Out, was writing about many, many years ago, or partly 100 years ago. The author's name was Cyril Hopkins. And if you are an agriculture student, I would say 50 years ago, you knew about Cyril Hopkins because teachers are always smart to figure out a way to get you to remember the things you need to remember. And they had a little mnemonic that they would put on the blackboard to teach you the elements that plants needed, the ones that were known in those days. And it said, C. Hopkins Cafe Mg. And that took you through carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, iron, and magnesium. So Cyril not only wrote books, but he was in everybody's classroom. Now, he wasn't just an oddball. Cyril happened to be the director of the Illinois State Experiment Station. And Cyril Hopkins published pamphlets. He published pamphlets back at the start of this century when the movement was to tell farmers, nature won't do it for you. You have to go out and buy these products. Well, Cyril was a pretty smart fellow, but he was determined to tell farmers that that wasn't true, and that if you put together all of those things I just mentioned, you had a great farming system. And also, if you added in the fact that there is about 20 to 50,000 pounds of potassium, an important plant nutrient, in the top 6 inches of an acre, and unmanageable more as you go down, and on into the fact that there is 70 million pounds of nitrogen in the air over every acre. To give you an idea, this is about a little under a half acre here. And that if you grew clovers, legumes, these plants that have the ability to take the nitrogen out of the air, and you grew them in a soil that had plenty of organic matter because you were growing a multiple of crops, you had it part-time in grasses and clovers, all of these things worked very nicely. So at this point, this guy is saying, wow, this really works. And I said, yeah, it really works, and I'll give you an example. We raise a lot of poultry. I raised a lot of poultry, and we raised them out on pasture because this is all great free food for them, and they'll go out and probably get about 40% of what they need. So I don't have to bring feed into these poultry, another thing you don't have to buy. And they start out like that, and then they move into that house that was there, which is just basically a sliding greenhouse. And the reason I put this up here is because everybody thinks, well, gee, you're going to be raising poultry. Okay, first you have to build an expensive house, then you're going to have to shovel out the poultry manure. And I said, well, if we're going to have the farm that doesn't wear out, let's have the farmer that doesn't wear out too. Let's see if we can't make this a lot easier. In the fall before, I had planted half of this field to winter wheat, and I had sprinkled clover seeds underneath it. The other half in the spring, I planted to spring wheat. Winter wheat, you plant in the fall, it matures sooner. Spring wheat, plant in the spring, and it matures after the winter wheat. And once the turkeys were up to a size that they could walk around, and we moved them from that first little house you saw into this house, we dragged the house over here, and we put little cross fences in, and we turned them in. When I told people I was growing wheat for my turkeys, they said, "How are you going to get it harvested? You don't have a combine." And I said, "Well, yeah, I'm going to have 100 two-legged combines, actually, whose favorite job is to wander through wheat fields and harvest the seeds," which isn't quite a complete diet for them, but you notice I've planted clover underneath it, and that clover is giving them the other half of it, plus pests and everything. And normally, if you're doing something like that and you're a good farmer, you're going to be worried about weeds. And I usually worry about weeds until I wandered out there one day, and I noticed that as far as the turkeys were concerned, what I thought were weeds, they called snacks. And this was something else they could eat along with the wheat and the clover. And so here they go, and it takes them, once the winter wheat has been eaten, we move them on into the spring wheat. It matures later. And during the course of that time, they have covered this with turkey manure. I haven't had to spread anything. And there's been clover there, which is a great soil improver, and all the straw from the wheat. And so the next year, or that fall, we till that up, and we plant corn there. That's the crop that's going to be there next year. And where the corn was, which was here last year, we put in a crop of half that field's in peas and half that field's in beans. And this is the food, that's also a legume improving the soil. This is the food that's going to feed the turkeys and actually other poultry before they get big enough to harvest their own. And it is all being grown on land that they've fertilized in this wonderful little rotation. And a second example is, and this is really the farm that won't wear out, if you want to run the perfect little farm or garden, whatever size it is, all you need is a field about 6 times bigger than the area you want to have your garden on. And you're going to put that into a mixture of grass and clover. And every year you will prepare, either plow up, disc up, rototill up 1/6 of that. And at the same time, you will put 1/6 of it that was plowed up back into grass and clover. And you're going to put an animal out there to eat the grass and clover, whether it's a small operation and it's one goat, or whether this is a large operation in acres and it's cattle. And the reason you're going to do that is the Rothamsted University did some wonderful studies where they found out that if you had 2 fields of grass, and one you just mowed and left it to make it more fertile, but the other one you had livestock on and they ate the grass and carried it off in their bodies, you actually had 15% higher yield off the grazed field when you tilled them both up because of the wonderful biological influx from the waste, the manure and urine from the livestock. In other words, we're back to that teaspoonful of fertile soil with all the bacteria in it, and why things are working, because there are these millions and millions of organisms in the soil that make the soil fertile. The one thing they demand is organic matter. So what is that, those 4 acres, 5 acres of grass and clover doing? If they're in for 4 years, they have so filled that soil with organic matter from their root mass that when you then till up the piece that's going to be your garden the next year, you are, in my experience, practically back to virgin soil. So all you have to do is just do this in this circular thing every year, and you really have the farm that won't wear out. Now, but aren't I taking stuff off this farm in the vegetables I harvest or in the body of the livestock? Yes, but if you mix into your grass and clover pasture, and there's another wonderful book by a man who looked into this for years, again, this is more than 100 years ago, and you grow deep-rooting crops, they will be bringing up so many nutrients from layers far below the 6 inches that people normally look at, that you will have perpetual fertility, as Cyril Hopkins wrote about. Now, you don't always have good soil, and on my farm, we we didn't get good soil. But when we dug a irrigation pond, we had a fascinating discovery. The top 2 feet that came off of there were a sort of mucky soil, high in organic matter, as you might expect, where one is to dig a pond. And then the stuff that came out from underneath was clay. Well, we're on a very sandy soil. It's missing clay. So wasn't it nice that this, my poor piece of the Maine coast, not only was offering me organic matter to improve my sandy soil, but clay to improve my sandy soil, but it got even better than that. And at this point, I began to wonder whether nature really is the most magical thing, because it was all there. If I analyzed the clay, it was high in calcium and potassium, 2 important nutrients. If I analyzed the muck soil, it was high in organic matter and phosphorus, the other important nutrient. And all of this was right there. And I kid people. I've lectured out in the Midwest. I came back from Iowa, and I said, Barbara, they have something in Iowa I've never seen before. She said, what's that? And I said, well, they got this stuff called soil. I said, you should see it. It's about 6 feet deep, and it looks like chocolate fudge mix. But I told those people out there that Mother Nature knew that New Englanders were far tougher than them, and she allowed us to mix our own as we took it out of places like that. So wherever you are, the resources exist to feed us forever and ever. And unfortunately, people have been fooled into believing that that isn't true. And there's a problem when you fool people, and I want to tell you one last little story here to tell you about that. This is one time when I fooled people. When we started on our place 40 years ago, it was all wooded, covered with trees, mostly spruce and fir trees with a few hardwoods here and there. And so we got a couple acres cleared, and we were running a very successful market garden, and I continued clearing land. And the Wall Street Journal heard that there was this farm running a totally different system than everybody else. And believe it or not, they sent up a reporter. And the day he arrived, I was out. I had cut the trees off and left stumps about 3 feet high for a reason. And I had my root axe, and I was chopping around these trees to chop their surface roots. Now, most of these were fir trees, and fir trees, they're easy to get out because they have mostly surface roots. And if you chop around those surface roots, and the reason I left the stumps 3 feet high was so I could get some purchase on them, you can usually rip them out. A lot of these, a number of them happen to also be spruce trees. I chopped the roots on them, but they have a taproot, so I was going to have to come back with more muscle or do some digging later. But while I'm chopping, I'm talking to the Wall Street Journal reporter. And finally I finish, and I grab one of the fir trees, and I rock it back and forth, and comes out of the ground. And he happened to be standing next to one of the spruce trees. Wall Street Journal reporters don't necessarily know the bark difference between spruce and fir. And I could see out of the corner of my eye he was going like this, trying to figure out what was going on. And when the article came out, he wrote about Eliot Coleman ripping stumps out of the ground with his bare hands. It gets better. The morning that issue came out, I happened to be on duty at our farm stand, and I saw this car come squealing into the parking lot, and this woman got out looking something like a Wagnerian opera singer, and she came purposefully striding into the stand, and I thought, oh my God, she thinks she's just read about the Paul Bunyan of her dreams here. And she came walking up to me at the stand, and she said, I want to meet Eliot Coleman, the man who pulls stumps with his bare hands. Well, I drew myself up to my full 5'8". Dropped my voice an octave, and I said, I'm Eliot Coleman. See, the problem is, when you fool people, the world will eventually find out what the truth is. And it's going to find that out about agriculture, and it is a biological solution. And I thank you very much. Whoops.
If you can hear